Hi, I'm Andy Brown, and today we'll be using simulation models to explore a major cause of problems going late and over budget. Problems with onboarding. Now, when things go wrong on projects, we often look for reasons, but usually we focus on our more immediate problems. For example, why different modules developed by different teams don't interface properly. Things like this. But in this session, I want to look at a different reason. Rather than look at the end of the project, where things are obviously going wrong, I want to explore the problems caused right at the start by the way that we ramp up our projects. In particular, I want to look at how issues with onboarding and getting resources up to speed can cause problems later on in the project. The learning point from this session is that things generally take a whole lot longer than we imagine they'll take. And doing those things generally takes a whole lot more resources than we realise. And one of those things is onboarding project resource effectively so that it's truly productive. So, how much longer do things take? And how much more resources than we expect do they take? Let's take an example first from a commodity market and then from environmental pollution. Suppose you're a pork farmer and there was a rise in prices in the pork market. How long do you think it would take you to react and take advantage of this price rise, producing more pork for the market and more profit for you? The process would be to withhold some mature sows from the market, breed from them, mature those piglets, and then send them to market. Now, the delays in doing this are 4 months, 5 months, and 2 months, giving a total of 11 months. So you might expect that you'd be able to react within a year from noticing an increase in demand to increasing your supply. In fact, the average time for an increase in the price of pork meat leading to an increase in supply is 24 months, almost twice as long as you may have expected. Now, there are various factors driving this increase in delay, but it's by no means unusual. Or if you take airborne pollutants in the USA, how long would it take from recognition of the problem to enacting the first real law to address pollutants? And then from enacting that law to the first measurable improvement in air quality. Here it took 22 years and 20 years respectively. Things generally take longer than we expect. And this is important for us here in software development, where very often we are driven by projects starting up and hopefully finishing off. Now, things don't always go right on projects. And as I said earlier, when things go wrong, we often look at the end of the project, when we're trying to put things together but not managing to do so, for an explanation of the problems. But often we should be looking at the other end of the project, the start, for an understanding of why things ended badly. Before we explore the model, I'd like you to think back to when you started a new role at a company. Now, everything was strange, wasn't it, yeah? You didn't understand the systems. You didn't know the people, the technology, or the processes. You didn't know how to get things done. Maybe you saw something that seemed really inefficient, so you made some suggestions for how to improve it. Or perhaps you even took the initiative and made some steps to improve it yourself. But then somebody told you why it was done that way and why your way made things worse, not better. In that new company, how long did it take you before you were fully 100% productive? Now, I don't mean you giving the appearance to others of being 100% productive and hoping you could gloss over the bits you didn't really understand. I mean really, truly 100% productive. I'm guessing it was probably a year or so before you were fully conversant with everything. It certainly wasn't a month, and it probably wasn't 6 months. If it was, then either the job was pretty simple, or the company and the job were pretty similar to the one you'd just been doing. My first job out of university was as an engineer installing scientific instruments around the world. And it took about 2 years to fully train someone for the job. Now, that was unfortunate because the average length of stay in the job was 4 years. Okay, let's look at the model. In the model, I've set the assimilation time, or time to become fully productive, to 1 year. Now, during that year, you're neither fully productive nor totally useless. You're somewhere in between. The longer you're there, the more up to speed you get. So, in the model, I divided the employees into 4 buckets. There's the experienced employees who've been at the company a year or more, and they're 100% productive. And there's the rookies who are completely unproductive. Either they don't produce anything, or much of what they do is wrong and needs to be redone, making their effective contribution 0. However, once the rookies get some experience, they become junior trainees, and they make a small contribution towards productivity. Their productivity rate is 25% of experienced employees. Once these junior trainees get more experience, they become senior trainees and they make a bigger contribution. Their productivity rate is 50% of that of experienced employees. These rookies, junior and senior employees all need time training. Otherwise, they'll never learn and become productive. Or they'll be making loads of mistakes and creating bugs. This training comes from the experienced employees. And of course, this training will take time away from the experienced employees, reducing their productivity. So the model takes account of that. The model allocates 30% of an experienced employee's time to each rookie. In other words, each rookie has 0.3 of an experienced employee assigned to them. Whilst the experienced employee is training the rookie, they're not producing stories, code, or whatever it is that we would measure as productivity or output. So, their output will drop whilst they're training rookies or whoever. The model also allocates 15% of an experienced employee's time to each junior trainee, and 10% to each senior trainee. Now, the model lets you change those values, and later we'll do just that, so we can see the effects of high training and low training. Now, you may think those training values are high. In fact, you probably can't think of a time when you joined a company in a new role and an experienced employee spent 30% of his or her time for the first few months showing you the ropes. You probably can't think of a time like that. But I'll bet you can think of a time when you joined a new company, you're given a brief whirlwind tour of the application, where the files are stored, how the team used Jira or whatever software was used to manage the project. You then spent the next few weeks or months trying to remember what you'd been told in those onboarding sessions. And during that time, you pretended to all and everyone that you knew what you were doing, as you didn't want to stand out as that one employee who just didn't get it. Because everybody else who started around the same time gets it and is fully productive. Or at least appears to be. So you pretend. And when you come across something you don't understand, you pretend you do understand and try to figure it out on your own. Now, the final part is to simulate the increase in resourcing for a project. Now, the model I'm taking is adapted from John Sterman's book, Business Dynamics. The model was originally developed to explore the effects of company growth, employee attrition and replacement. But I've adapted it to explore the effects of an organisation embarking upon a major project. I do this by inputting a surge of employees, simulating a recruitment surge at the start of a project. Of course, projects can be different sizes, so I've built the model so you can adjust the size of the project. We'll start off by using a 10% surge. This means that the project will take on employees, or more realistically, contractors or consultants, equal to 10% of the existing employees. Of course, those existing employees would be in IT or whatever project is taking place. Those experienced employees need relevant knowledge to be able to train the rookies. So, if you're a supermarket with 20,000 employees, 500 of whom are in IT, the 10% surge would be an IT project of 50 new employees or contractors. 10% of the 500 in IT. The model allows you to surge up to 400% of your existing employees. Now, this sounds quite a lot when you stop to think about it. But I've been on plenty of projects, and I'm sure you have too, where practically nobody was a full-time permanent employee. And it was extremely difficult getting answers to anything about how the organisation did business. So 400% is probably not that unusual. And we'll see that this causes considerable problems. So this is the engine of the model. We hire people in who come in as rookies and are completely unproductive. Some of them quit. After a while they gain experience, move to the junior trainee bucket and do contribute to productivity. Some of them quit, but most of them go on to become senior trainees where they are more productive. Eventually they become experienced employees where they are fully productive. At every stage a proportion of the employees, and in that I'm including contractors, may quit. We need to replace those that quit, so that the rookie hire rate, which is determined by the quit rate of all employees and the number of experienced employees, matches the quit rate. As well as the number of employees we have at various levels of experience, what we're really interested in is how much is being produced. So I've built a part of the model down here that works out the production by each employee grade. How much is produced in total, which is here called potential output. We can combine this potential output with the total number of employees to get the average productivity. Now, we're interested in exploring how ramping up for a project and onboarding new hires can cause us problems later in the project, if that onboarding and training has not gone well. And a major reason it may not go well is that when we're onboarding those new hires, the people who should be training them, the experienced employees, are probably already overloaded. If they weren't, then we wouldn't need to hire more people. Therefore, we're expecting the experienced employees, who are probably already overloaded with work, to divert a proportion of their time away from their routine day job and into training others. Therefore, the model needs to take account of the time spent by these experienced employees, which is lost from production and gained by training. This is where we model that process. We take the amount of experienced employees, and from that we subtract the time spent training rookies, the time spent training juniors, and the time spent training seniors. That leaves us with the effective experienced employees, which is the amount of time that experienced employees are able to dedicate towards production. We work out the time spent training rookies, juniors and seniors by taking the number of rookie employees and multiplying it by the fraction of experienced time we allocate to training a rookie. We can understand that if it's a small project, then the amount of productive time lost by the experienced employees will be small. But on a big project, that amount could be large. And on a very large project, or a project where the temporary project team is much larger than the permanent employees, the only ones able to pass on the knowledge, we can imagine how those experienced employees may well run out of time, particularly when you think of all the other demands that are likely to be on them as a result of the organisation ramping up for a large project. That's everything important in the model. Now let's run the model. We'll start by running a base run. Here we just accept the default settings, which is a 10% project ramp up, rookie employees get 30% of an experienced employee's time, junior trainees get 20% of an experienced employee's time, and senior trainees get 15%. We'll move to another screen I created. On this dashboard you can see a whole bank of graphs. So whatever you're interested in, you can probably make a graph for it and put it on here. Here we've got the rookie hire rate, which is a pulse function, where we ramp up the project with the number of employees we require. You can see it as a pulse of 100. That's because the steady state number of employees is 1000, and this is a 10% pulse. Also, you can see that the hire rate is never zero. That's because employees are always quitting and need replacement. Next, we have graphs of the employees by grade, rookies, junior, senior and experienced. You can see the number of rookies jumps from 50 to 150 as we recruit for the project. That number decays as those rookies gain experience and become assimilated as junior trainees. Eventually, the rookie count falls back to 50. So this company with 1,000 experienced employees always has around 50 rookies who are needed to replace those quitting. Next, you see the junior trainees. This value ramps up as that influx of rookies gain experience. It then peaks at around 20 weeks and then decays. Next, you see the senior trainees. This ramps up as the influx of juniors gain experience and become seniors. It peaks around 40 weeks, then falls back down as the seniors become more experienced. The experienced employees ramps up to the new level required to resource the normal amount of work plus the project. If you expand the graph, you can see that after 100 weeks, or 2 years, it's approaching 1,100 employees, or 1,000 employees plus 10%. The next set of graphs looks at the employees by fraction. The thing to note here is that the influx of new employees causes a temporary change in those fractions, but eventually they go back towards their steady state. And an important thing we'll note is that the steady state for experienced employees is around 87%. Next, we have a series of graphs showing the quit rate by employee grade. It's not important for what we're doing here, but you can imagine it being useful if you're trying to understand a problem around high employee turnover. Next, we have a series of graphs of production rates. The important thing to note here is that most of the work is produced by the experienced employees. First, because they're more productive than the other grades, and secondly, there are far more of them. In the last column, we've got some graphs to do with potential output, productivity, and effective experienced employees, which you'll remember is the number of experienced employees producing work minus those experienced employees who are training and onboarding the more junior grades. Underneath these, we've got some controls so we can vary what the model is doing. The ones we're most interested in are the project surge as a percentage and the sliders for the fraction of experienced time allocated to training rookies, juniors and seniors. I also made another view where we can look at how quickly or otherwise the rookies, juniors and seniors are being assimilated into the next grade up. And finally, I've built a screen called Output and Productivity. It has just 2 graphs plus the sliders we're most interested in. We see on the left the potential output, and we can see that it starts at 1,000 units per week, then dips slightly when we onboard and train people. It then rises up as those new people begin to become productive. If we expand the y-axis, we can see that it's only after about 16 weeks that our output level returns to the level it was at before we took on the large influx of people to run the project. Also, we can see that even after 100 weeks, the output has not fully increased by 10%. The number of employees we've surged to resource the project. If we look at the graph on the right, the average productivity, we can see that this productivity drops from around 88% to around 79%. And at 100 weeks, the productivity has just reached the level it was at before we onboarded the people for the project. Next, let's look at if we can make any difference by adjusting the level of training given to new employees. Let's call this run high training. We'll leave the project surge as 10%, but we'll double the fraction of time allocated to training rookies, juniors and seniors. So we'll increase the fraction of time for rookies from 0.3 to 0.6 or 60%, and we'll increase the fraction of time for juniors to 0.3, and we'll increase the fraction of time for seniors to 0.2. We can now see that the potential output dips to around 940, whereas before it only dipped to around 980. But we can see that after 100 weeks the output is much higher, around 1,160 as opposed to 1,095. And if we looked at the average productivity, we can see that it dips down below 0.06, but then rises strongly, ending up around 0.94 compared with 0.88 in the base case. So we can see that we are far better off taking a short-term hit on reduced productivity in order to get long-term benefits. Next, let's look at what happens if, instead of doing a high level of training, you do a low level of training. Let's call this run low training. Let's reduce the training levels to half of the base case. This means reducing the time for rookies to 0.15, the time for juniors to 0.07, and the time for seniors to 0.05. We see that despite adding more employees, our output has not increased. Similarly, we see that the average productivity drops but never recovers. Why might this be? If we move to the screen for assimilation rates, we see the answer. Those new hires we took on were rapidly assimilated into more productive employees in the base case and the high training case. But we can see with the low training that many of those new hires are still trainees to all intents and purposes. So the lesson here is that if you have ramped up, taken on a whole bunch of employees, but you're not getting a whole lot more work done, ask yourself, how good was the onboarding and training we gave to those people? Next, let's look at what happens if you're not trying to resource for a small project with a 10% ramp up, but instead you're ramping up for a major project, say anywhere between 100% ramp up and 400% ramp up. Because you encounter a few more complexities when you ramp up by a significant proportion of your permanent staff that you won't have if it's just a small ramp up. Let's call this run mid-surge. Let's set the project surge to 100%, which means that for every permanent experienced employee on the project, there's one newbie, consultant or contractor. And we'll leave the onboarding fractions the same as the base case. You can see there's a significant dip in the output and productivity. The output dropping to 750 units, or 75% of what you produced before the surge, before eventually rising to just over 1,800 units, or an 80% increase, which of course you've paid for with a 100% increase in your staffing levels. Looking at productivity, you can see that this drops to a minimum value of around 0.35 or 35%, before eventually rising to around 0.85, which is just slightly below your productivity before the project surge. But what happens if the project is much bigger? And often they are. What happens if the project surge is not 100% but 400%? Well, let's find out. Let's call this high surge. And let's set the project surge to 400%, which means that for every permanent employee on the project, there are 4 contractors. I've been on lots of projects like this, and I'm sure you have too. Straight away, you see something pretty frightening. You take on a whole bunch of new hires, and your potential output and productivity drop to 0. Why is this? Well, of course, it's because all your experienced employees are spending all their time training up the rookies. In real life, things might actually be worse than this, because you're ramping up this hard and this fast, then your experienced employees are probably needing to do lots of other things over and above training, like recruiting and interviewing, setting up accounts, environments, and so on. So, although this may only be a model and it may not be realistic in some ways, don't think that real life is likely to be any better. In all probability, this model may be unrealistic in that it's not as bad as it would be in real life. We can confirm that productivity is low due to experienced employee resources being directed towards onboarding and training by looking at the graph for experienced employee production, which is on the dashboard. Here we can see that the production flatlines at 0 for several weeks. This is why we see a kink in our graph for potential output and productivity. If we look at the final value for the potential output at 100 weeks, we can see that it's just over 4,000. If you had perfect efficiency, then adding 4,000 more employees should have increased that to 5,000, but it hasn't. That's because the average productivity, which we can see on the right-hand graph, has never recovered to its original higher values. Is there anything else we could do to improve our project? Well, let's try adjusting the training. Giving those new hires more training worked before when we surged our project team by 10%. So let's try it again. And let's call it high surge, high training. We can see that if we do that, we've made a big improvement. We've increased our output from 4,200 to 4,800. And we've increased our average productivity to around 93%, as good as it's ever been. We also see that our kink is more pronounced, which is telling us that our model is starting to break down as it's not been designed to work in this situation. However, it's still good enough for our purposes. What this model tells us is that if you need to make a significant project surge like this, then you're better off avoiding the temptation to skimp on the training and onboarding, even though the consequences of that skimping will be invisible. These two graphs clearly show that you will eventually get far more output and far more productivity from doing so. However, in many organisations, you're unable to do this, and the reason goes as follows. Here, on this graph and using this model, I can clearly show you that you're getting far more output by investing in training in your rookies. However, the managers and stakeholders in the organisation never see this final graph. They never see it because they can never see it, at least at the point in time when they're making important decisions. Managers cannot see into the future, at least not with the certainty that we can look into the future with this model. All they can see is the present and the past. That's the equivalent of taking this graph here and looking at just a small portion of it. So let's do that. Here, we're looking at those first 10 weeks, and your project surge began on week 5. Imagine you're a stakeholder on that project. You've given approval for the project to ramp up by 400%. Your butt is on the line if you don't deliver. Suddenly, output goes down from 1,000 units per week to below 50. A drop of 95%. How can you explain that to your boss? If you can't show some improvement and pretty quick, you're going to be looking for a new job. So you put pressure on the project to at least get something out of the door. You need to show some improvement. The people on the project will respond to this. And they'll respond by cutting back the training they're giving. They'll make themselves less available to answer questions, set up user accounts, smooth over problems. The result is that you'll see some immediate improvement, and you can show that to your boss. And he or she is likely to respond by saying something like, "Good. Can we expect to see more improvement next week?" Of course, there's only one way you can answer that and still keep your job. So you say yes. And so the journey to project overrun begins. Because your horizon and your boss's horizon is about 1 week. Like you can see on the graph. You can't see out to 100 weeks like this. So you can't see that the decisions you're making now are damaging your productivity 2 years down the line. You may think that you'd behave differently, but in all probability you won't. How do I know this? Well, I can set this model up to run in game mode, allowing players to make decisions about where to allocate their resources. And when you do this, you find that we make exactly the same sorts of decisions and exactly the same sorts of mistakes that we do when we're running a real project. It's only after you've run through a simulation project a few times you begin to learn and make improvements. Now, I'll be running a few taster sessions of simulations like this in the future. If you're interested in joining those sessions, please send us a message and I'll get back to you with some details. Thanks for watching. If you're interested in this session, please give me a thumbs up on the link below. And if you're interested in this topic, please hit the subscribe button. Thanks for watching. I hope to see you again.